Tracing Your Family Roots. I'm Chuck Mason, and Janelle unfortunately is not able to be with us, so we have someone who has come back to rejoin us. This is Arlene Sachs. Arlene is one of the founding two people that started the show many years ago, and she's also married to our producer, Sydney Sachs. So we do want to thank the Mount Vernon Genealogical Society for sponsoring the show, and we want to thank Sydney and all of the crew for being here and making this possible. So today we're going to talk about a topic that most genealogists face. It's keeping family secrets. As genealogists, we all discover things that family members may not generally know, that it may be a big deal still to people, whether the secret is revealed or not. And so we're going to talk about that. So Arlene is going to kind of interview me.
So what really is a family secret, or what do you consider a secret then?
You know, a secret is anything that could be anything that a family member considers a secret, but anything that's generally not common knowledge in the family. It may be something that part of the family knows and the rest doesn't know. And then it may be something that all of a sudden when you discover it, it's a surprise to everybody. I had a great aunt and uncle that were divorced. Nobody in the family, of course, most of my grandparents' generation were gone, and most of my mother's generation was also gone. So it was like my cousins, so, great nieces and nephews that are still living when I discovered this. And I talked to a few people and nobody knew till I found it.
I think in a way that shows so much of how a life and what we think of today has changed from 100 years ago, which is when our grandparents and parents might have been around. Right. Things that were terrible then are fine now, and we talk about them. I just happen to have read this book. We're not pushing it or anything. It's called, but I want to just show this for a minute. It's called Schande. And Schande is a Yiddish word. It sort of means like shame. It's something, oh my God, you don't want anybody to know about it. And she's exploring her own family and finds all sorts of things, like, heaven forbid, her parents were each married and each had a child before, and no one knew about it. And then after they got married, they changed their wedding date, so then the kids could be theirs, and they moved away, so only the immediate family who knew them years ago would know about it. This was something that was absolutely horrible. What do we think of a divorce these days? It's nothing.
Yeah, it's commonplace, but it could be any kind of a secret. It might be there was adultery in the family, or alcoholism, or
not
academic
even
performance.
Yeah.
Somebody may have had a brush with the law, and it was maybe they kid picked up some candy in a store or something, or it may have something to do with a divorce.
Those are even more secret than I think. A child repeating a grade. Oh my God, that child is so dumb they had to repeat a grade. But children now, we know that people develop at different ages, and sometimes a 6-year-old just isn't old enough to start a school.
And I repeated third grade. I had a terrible year. We had third and fourth in there. We lost our teacher. We had substitutes. And I had several illnesses and an operation in that third grade.
But you didn't talk about it. Your parents would not have admitted that.
My parents didn't make a big deal out of it. But
your parents to you, maybe.
Well,
but
no,
they would not
to other people. I mean, it was common knowledge in the neighborhood and everything. He's going because they changed the school that I went to for the second year. So I'm going to a different school from the other kids in the neighborhood who are going to fourth grade around the corner. And, many years later, 20 plus years later, my nephew repeated third grade. Nobody knew until he should have gone into seventh grade. So, it could be other things, marriage out of wedlock was another thing.
Not the you mean a child out of wedlock?
Child out of wedlock, rather, or, other things. So it can be anything at all. But the one thing we don't want to do when we find these things is apply today's standards to the timing. Particularly in marriages. I knew someone who was researching their family up in the upper Midwest, and they had the circuit riding priests for the Catholic Church. Well, it took more than a year for them to ride the circuit, and so they found that they couldn't find a marriage for the parents, and yet they had, I think it was 2 children by the time they finally found records.
And again,
that was something that was normal then.
Yes. I think a lot of these things among Jews, particularly in Eastern Europe too, they didn't want to have anything to do with the legal system, with the state, with the country. They had their own religious service as far as they were concerned. The kids were fine. But you might find marriage records where the kids are teens and suddenly they have 6 kids and they get. But those are not things to be ashamed of. Those are things that happen to show up on records.
Yeah.
But it shows how life was then.
Yeah. And the other things with marriage is, they may not have married in the church that the family went to. They may have gone off, as a number of my relatives did, went off to Elkton, Maryland, instead of being married in Pennsylvania or New Jersey where they lived for a variety of reasons. So, it's looking at all the facts before you judge people.
Yeah.
So.
Well, what do you think we should share?
Well, a lot of that's going to depend on what the secret is, who might be involved in the secret, and who may be the collateral or the other people in the family, and how they're going to accept or be upset if the secret was to be revealed. My mother's father had a younger brother who was divorced. Nobody in the family knew this. He was in World War I, stationed in New Orleans, got out of the military, became a New Orleans policeman, went back into World War II, and died in World War II. And so I got his military records. That's when I found there was this secret. Now, my grandmother and his widow, I know, wrote letters back and forth. I know a couple of my mother's siblings and their spouses went and visited them and all down in New Orleans. But when I found that there was a second wife in the military files, most of the people I would have called who might have known were dead. But I did call one of my aunts and I asked her if she knew, because she had lived with my grandmother while my uncle was in World War II, at least for a couple of years. And so, I knew she was in the household. My mother was gone. She was in the household, that she might have, seen a letter or something. She knew nothing about it. So she said, "How did you find that out?" Or where did? And I said, "Well, I found it in his military file, so I think it's got to be pretty accurate." So then I went and I got the divorce file. And actually the census when he was listed in the household with his first wife and his children was a lie. I later found he was living somewhere else when I knew to go looking further.
Well, we've long time ago already found you barely trust census records. It's possibly a way to start, but remember, a census was filled out or gave the information by whoever answered the door. Sure. In my husband's case, I think his brother was 11, and he's the one that's checked off as giving the answers. So what does 11-year-old know? Even if adults know about a divorce, 11-year-old might not. So you've got to keep that in mind when you're looking at records.
And of course, they didn't always answer truthfully. My father's mother, I analyzed this, and I know she most likely was the one, because of the age of the children being too young or them being in school, and my grandfather working, she had to have been the one. Well, she lied about where she was born.
Well,
Three censuses plus other
and
records.
my husband's family, we've got it for 1900, 1910, 1920. Every woman aged 7 years in the 10-year period. The males all went 10 years. But they were consistent in that, and that's another thing you can call a lie. But but no woman would admit how old she was.
Yeah.
And to have a 24-year-old girl that wasn't married yet would have been terrible.
Yeah.
So
I found an interesting one. It was the opposite. The men aged less than 10 years, or the husband aged less than 10 years in this family. By the time 4 censuses had been taken, she had aged 54 years.
Oh, gosh.
and it's like, gee, I wonder who answered those questions.
Well,
You know,
again, it's it depends on who. In some of the censuses, it was checked off that who does it, especially 1900, 1910.
Yeah.
Well, I know 1930 is when my brother-in-law would have answered it, but he was 11 years old. No,
Yeah.
they couldn't have been. 9 years old he
years
was.
old, yeah.
But so it depends on, and these later censuses I don't think show who answered the questions.
Another thing is, what is your purpose for sharing the secret? Is there a real reason for sharing it? That can also determine, how much you might share.
I think also how long ago it was.
Yeah.
At this point, if it's something that's 100 years ago, and you find something out, I think it just gives you a better picture of what life was like and what had to be hidden or was considered a shame in those days.
Yeah.
So you got to keep that in mind.
Yeah, I mean, I happened to get a hold of a divorce file from one of my aunts from her first marriage and all, and it filled in and corrected some of the misunderstandings, some of the things that I sat there and I hear the stories and that doesn't make sense to me. So it did, and initially I didn't share it with anyone but my parents. I have told other family members, but not advertised it. But I did not share it with my cousin who was from the second marriage, and I did not say anything to his daughter, her daughter, who is still living. She's in her early 80s. So I've just kept that one to myself.
And I heard of one that I really objected to and disagreed with, a man that worked in an archive, and if he found out something terrible about what the parents did, this deals with the Holocaust, like they could have been, I think the word was capo, that they told something and they did not tell that person's descendants.
Yeah.
And I disagreed with that. I think it should have been for historical purposes. But this man felt he was doing something good, what we call a mitzvah, by not telling them that their ancestor had done something so terrible. So, that's really a really tough decision at whether you want to disclose something like that.
Right. And of course, kind of our next question is with who we should share the secrets. And, in some cases, it's something that it's no big deal if everybody knows. But if there are still people who are involved, you definitely want to be careful
living
before.
People.
And even their children. I had someone that I knew that everybody in the family knew one of her uncles had been married before and had a couple of children, divorced that first wife and remarried and had 4 or 5 other children. And there was a family gathering that something came up and she had found something out about the first family. And she just casually mentioned it to her cousins and they all gasped. None of them knew that their father had been married before, and they had 2 half-siblings. So she had to do some backpedaling there for a little while.
We met a woman once she didn't know she was adopted until she was in her 60s. She had been adopted in Germany as a baby. She came to the U.S. as a war bride. And so forever, as long as her husband was alive, somehow it was under his name because he was the military person.
Right.
And it wasn't until after he had died that she went to get a passport on her own, had to write back to Germany to get her passport, to get her birth certificate, and then found out she'd been adopted. This woman was 60 years old.
Well, I have a friend whose sister was almost 50 when she found out the man that she thought was her father was not her father. Her mother had married and had 2 children and divorced, and then she was seeing one guy and got pregnant, but married a second guy she was seeing, and so she thought that was her father till her sisters knew, and finally she actually said to me, she said, "Here's my problem. Things are really getting to the point where I think my sister should know. How would you handle it?" So I gave her some things to do, some options of what she may do.
Some people I think are very open about it now and would laugh at it. And others that are perhaps more religious would be very upset about something like that. You have to know their people.
One of the other things we need to think about is, does it directly affect the person that you are sharing it with? And, especially today with like health histories and things like that, there can be things that the person thinks one thing because they think their parents are certain people, and yet there could be something in their biological background that they should be aware of.
Yeah, especially if somebody's a child is adopted, they grow up never knowing they're adopted, but yet there's something that, that they have a tendency to whatever it might be that they need to watch out for.
Yeah, and in some cases, it may still be sensitive enough that we only want to share it with the immediate people that it affects. We may not want to write it in the genealogy book we're writing, and
maybe not in the book, but under notes in your own computer file or whatever.
Yeah.
But that brings another subject.
I have a number of things that I have in my files that I still feel there may be people that might be upset if I were to reveal things that.
But if you give it to the next generation, by another generation, they're not going to care about whatever that particular.
And most of the things I have are things that, if somebody's doing research, they're going to find out what I have found out. So, other things. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to ask you, what about legal things? And we've sort of touched on that in divorces.
That's the thing that we really need to look at is legal and ethical kind of rules of revealing things. We don't want to put things out there that can cause harm or embarrassment to people or some other kind of damage, because we can set ourselves up for a lawsuit if we do certain things.
God, I never even thought of that, something like that.
Today, in the age of everybody wants to sue everybody for things.
On the other hand, everything is on Facebook or.
Well, yeah, that's true with some things, but we do need to think about those things. Is it going to be something we're going to reveal that someone could go and file a lawsuit? May not be a case of they're going to win, but still going through being sued requires you to spend money to get an attorney to defend you and all of the other things.
Back at you for telling people that.
Yeah, and
I mean, there's another way of looking at it. What business is it of anybody else's what I did 50 years ago or whatever?
So it's one thing that we should take and respect people's privacy and, think about it. Another thing is, what is the age appropriateness of sharing a secret? Is it something that, a child really needs to know? Probably not. But, you know, is it something that maybe a teenager or someone in their 20s or a much older person may know? Other things to think about is the parties involved. Is anyone still living? You know, that could be an issue. You may want to, if you're going to reveal something, you may want to go and discuss it with the person or persons involved before you say
If you're doing
anything.
genealogy and found your grandmother had a previous marriage, and she's never mentioned it, you probably don't want to go
Well,
telling everybody
since
about that.
My grandmothers have been dead since 1965 and 73.
I'm assuming the grandmother was still alive.
Yeah, but yes, if it was, you know, well, you know, my sisters are now grandmothers. Our parents are gone. You know, my sisters are grandmothers. Well, you know, if somebody found they had a marriage and nobody knew, we might want to take and do that. You know, one of the things to consider is, will revealing the secret fill in missing pieces? And that certainly was true when I found my aunt's divorce file from her first marriage. The story that people told did not quite make sense to me. You know, the story was she married a guy who went into the military and she got pregnant, and then when he was discharged, he came back and just abandoned her. And I thought, it just didn't make sense. Plus, my uncle marrying her and adopting the child, you know, the timing didn't make sense. And so when I got the file, I found out, okay, it wasn't that he really abandoned her and the child. It was he had probably what we call PSDT today. And so therefore, health issues were the thing. And of course, my uncle didn't adopt the child when she was 6 months old, because I knew that it took 2 years to get a divorce minimum in New Jersey. So I knew that couldn't happen, but it made no sense. And so all the blanks were filled in when
Sometimes
I got
you
it.
find that one thing, or when people have lied on censuses or whatever, and you're going by that, and suddenly you find that one thing, that makes everything else fit.
Yeah.
But,
and of course, you know, other things that you want to do, if you can, is find documentation, find the documents. You know, in the case of the divorce file, that answered, you know, all of the questions, contradicted most of the family stories that I had heard growing up. And so, you know, if I were to reveal something like that and somebody were to get upset and decide to sue me, you know, I've got the documents. I'm not lying or making this up. Here are the documents that prove what actually happened.
And in your own personal records, or the records that go to the family, you might have something. You don't necessarily have to publish them if you're publishing a book.
Right.
So you know, that would lead to a suit more than what you have or what you've shared with your family, the immediate family, if you're a page like you are, a professional genealogist.
Yeah, and that kind of reminds me of with talking with divorces. There was a family that lived down the street, and I knew that the father had been married before. Well, lo and behold, recently I've just been looking around the neighborhood and found out the mother, that was her third husband. She had 2 boys from the third marriage. She had a son from the first and a son from the second that I never knew about, but census records are out there and tell you. And of course, I found out what her actual name was. We always knew her as Pat, but her actual name, given name, was Hattie.
Well, see, that's so she's starting a complete new life with a new name, I mean, that's one of the things that happens in this book too. That the family moved away, where the family knew about it, but their neighbors didn't, because that would have been a shame for anybody else to know about it. So In one case, it was revealed only because one cousin got mad at the other and was yelling at her, and well, you're not her real daughter anyway, or whatever
Yeah.
the situation might have been.
Well, and that was what I found was the first marriage took place down in Delaware.
Okay.
And I don't know or don't remember on the second marriage, but everything else was in New Jersey. And of course, today, only the youngest son from that third marriage is still living. And I have no idea where he's living or anything. But, you know, Ancestry pops up lots of little things that can be surprises.
Well, when you mention Ancestry, I want to say that you want to really be aware of how many errors there are out there in these things that you find online. Don't believe them. I mean, I tried to get in touch with somebody once who had something way off but somebody's going to believe that about my great-great-grandfather. Yeah. He had a name very similar to somebody across the river. And there's at least one printed book that lumps these two people as one, saying he also did that, but they were two different people. And that's out there on the web, and I haven't been able to correct it.
I was just playing with Ancestry the other day, and I went looking. I looked my father up. I wanted to see if anything new came up. Well, up came a list of residences, and they had 3 correct ones, but they had him living in East Orange, New Jersey at one point. My father never lived more than a mile and a half from where he was born, any of his life. So, you know, he when he was buried, he's the furthest he's ever been away from.
Was there somebody else with a similar name?
Yeah, it's somebody, Charles Mason.
Yeah, okay.
So, unfortunately, we are running out of time, but, you know, I think this is interesting to our viewers. Hopefully,
something to keep in mind when they're doing their genealogy or thinking of publishing a book or something. Do you want to share this, and do you have the permission to share it if you're going to do a real publication of some kind?
And I want to thank you, Arlene, for coming in and filling in for Janelle. It's always great to have you come back, and
it's fun to do it again.
We get to see Sid once a month, but we don't get to see you very